Struggle to Make Human Research Safe by Robert L. Klitzman. To the men and women who shared their views and experiences with me for this book. To Renee C. Fox for her extraordinary guidance and inspiration. Part 1. Introduction. Chapter 1. Protecting the people we experiment on. The experiment worked, the doctor told me, but the patient died. The patient was my father. At the age of 78, my father had been diagnosed with acute myelogenous leukemia, skyrocketing numbers of white blood cells. 3 months earlier, the same doctor had told me that my father would probably only live 3 months, and that no effective therapy existed for adults with this disease, and that most doctors would not offer any intervention. We could try chemotherapy, the doctor offered, but it would be a bit of an experiment. What are the odds it might work? I asked. Without it, he will probably die within 3 months. With it, there's a 50% chance that he could live an additional 3 to 18 months. The doctor's tone was upbeat. He seemed optimistic. Medicine inherently involves trial and error. Hence, as a newly minted physician and researcher, although in other areas, not cancer, I valued experiments in clinical care, whether for an individual patient or a large group. Doctors regularly publish the research of ever-evolving approaches to treating cancer and other diseases. Over the years, experimentation on human beings, whether formal or informal, has aided countless individuals and advanced science. Such research has shed light on why we get sick and helped us develop effective ways to treat everything from heart attacks to depression. Trial and error has yielded new drugs for bacterial pneumonia and HIV, and countless lives are now saved each year by reducing people's cholesterol and high blood pressure. New medical devices have replaced millions of broken hips, knees, and heart valves. Systematic studies to develop vaccines have shielded billions of people from lethal plagues. Science burgeons in ever new areas, from stem cell research to treatments for the flu. We all are, have been, or will be patients, not to mention the friends and family members of patients who benefit from these discoveries. At the same time, every year, many patients agree to treatments that may not work, that are, to varying degrees, experimental, for a wide array of diseases. These efforts range from explicit research studies and clinical trials to risky interventions whose benefits, if any, are unknown or ambiguous. Some trials compare different common but competing therapies. Others test new unproven approaches against standard interventions, placebos, or no treatment at all. Doctors may encourage patients and families to try these novel approaches when no proven cure is available. Unfortunately, these strategies often fail as well, giving the patient no clear benefit. When his physician offered chemotherapy, my father was torn. Raised in the Great Depression, my dad was a hard realist. He already felt terrible from the leukemia, but he wasn't ready to give up all hope. My mother thought that the chemotherapy side effects on top of his suffering from cancer made it too risky. "What do you think?" he asked me one night by his bedside. He turned to me and looked at me intently, his eyes wide, concentrating on my response as he had only a few other times in my life. The prospect of my father's death horrified me. I had also just finished my medical training and was imbued with a sense of the possibilities that medical research offered. "I think you should try it," I said, surprised at how firm my voice sounded. The next day, he agreed, partly, I sensed, because of my answer. For the next few weeks, he was extremely uncomfortable, the unremitting nausea and malaise. He lost weight, felt weaker, and looked worse. The physician who had suggested the treatment began visiting his room far less frequently. 3 months after he started the drugs, my father's blood count did, in fact, return to normal, but he died almost immediately. the side effects of his treatment had killed him. The manner of my father's death and my part in it have haunted me ever since. I knew that he could die, but I still felt shocked and let down by the fact that science had failed to prolong his life any longer than if he had declined the experimental drugs. Instead, the experiment had arguably made him suffer more, not less. I wonder whether my mother's wish to let him die in peace had been right, whether I had been biased, too pro-science. Had my father valued my opinion too much? I kept wondering if I or the doctor should have acted differently, if the doctor had presented the chance of success too optimistically and overly downplayed the risks, and if he should have guided us more thoughtfully through these decisions. My father may have sacrificed the comfort of his final weeks to help other patients in the future. If he had known that, would he have said yes? What unproven treatments should we offer patients, and how? My father's treatment had been an informal experiment, an offer by a physician that we had decided to accept, which happens routinely. As a medical intern, I had worked in a cancer ward where a large number of patients were on experimental drugs, some, but not all, in formal clinical trials. Many of the patients in these trials died as well. They had been told that the odds of success were not high, but they were desperate. Hopefully, all of these deaths furthered scientific knowledge in some way, if only to demonstrate that certain approaches that seemed promising were ineffective. My father's death made me far more sensitive to the plight of patients and family members confronting fatal illness and the anguish of the decisions they face. I now understood more fully the criticisms that researchers take advantage of patients' vulnerability, pushing risky interventions rather than encouraging the dying to focus on the quality of the time that they have left. At the same time, as a doctor, I knew that the only way to improve treatment of leukemia and other devastating diseases was by experimenting on humans. Indeed, since my father's death in 1994, subsequent studies have led to the development of a promising new experimental treatment for leukemia involving bone marrow transplants. This approach might have helped him had it been available, but it was not. Ethics and science, striking a balance. We are living in a golden age of science. In the second half of the 20th century and the start of the 21st, researchers have unraveled the genetic code for all life, glimpsed the inner workings of the human mind as never before, discovered new particles inside of atoms that constitute all matter, and landed spacecrafts on the moon, Mars, and comets. Many of the achievements that have advanced biomedicine have also, by necessity, involved human subjects, posing myriad cultural, ethical, and legal questions. These trade-offs are so intricate that every year scandals erupt, unforeseen by those involved. It is tempting to ignore the challenges they pose for the same reason. They represent profound puzzles about science, morals, ethics, greed, knowledge, globalization, and justice, but we must not do so. Though integral to scientific research, trial and error has failed countless individual patients along the way before benefiting the common good. Ever since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818 and doctors began stealing corpses from cemeteries to study the human anatomy, the mad scientist who experiments on humans to satisfy his own intellectual curiosity or desire for power or wealth has lurked as a sinister figure in the collective imagination. Rebecca Skloot's 2010 book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which explores the ethics of human tissue samples for medical research without the donor's knowledge or consent, has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over a year and has been translated into more than 25 languages. More recently, Facebook entered 700,000 users into an experiment without their knowledge, manipulating their news feeds by reducing the number of posts which either positive or negative emotional content that they automatically saw from their friends. In July 2014, the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a prestigious scientific journal, published the results, showing that a company had thereby been able to alter the user's moods, but no informed consent had been obtained. Only after the experiment did Facebook add to its user agreement that it may use data for research. A public outcry erupted. In July 2014, 2 Americans acquired Ebola as part of a growing epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. They received a new experimental drug that had never been tried in humans, and, over the subsequent days, seemed to improve. A worldwide debate ensued as to whether this new drug should now be produced and distributed far more widely without waiting first for additional tests to examine its potential risks and benefits. Whether in this public health emergency, the usual standards for protecting research subjects should be abandoned, and if so, which patients should receive the experimental medication first. New possible treatments and vaccines being developed against Ebola, as of this writing, pose questions. How much evidence of effectiveness or safety should be required before these products are given to ever-increasing numbers of individuals? Most people take for granted that some mechanism exists to balance these often competing scientific and humanist agendas, that some of the laws or group of watchdogs is in place to ensure that scientists who experiment on humans do so in ethical and appropriate ways. Most of us have little or no understanding of what this mechanism is, however, and never will unless we come to feel that it has betrayed us, if even then. In fact, such safeguards do exist in the form of research ethics committees, RECs, or, as they are known in the United States, institutional review boards, IRBs. These committees regularly review and approve countless experiments involving human beings in this country. In recent years, however, these committees have become increasingly controversial. Whereas the general public only hears or complains about this system of oversight when an ethical breach comes to light, when a healthy patient dies in a supposedly low-risk clinical study, or a researcher is caught falsifying data, researchers regularly criticize IRBs. Investigators frequently argue that these committees are now stymieing rather than supporting scientific progress. Indeed, almost every researcher I know has complained at some point, often ferociously, about an IRB having unnecessarily blocked or delayed his or her research. The growing hostility towards IRBs. These complaints have been mounting, in part because over the past 40 years, since the development of the regulations began, science has burgeoned and evolved, becoming ever more complex. The past 4 decades have witnessed an extraordinarily unheralded explosion of medical research. Every year, the U.S. now spends over $100 billion on biomedical studies, around 30% by the government, mostly the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, 65% by industry, and 5% by others. Between 1994 and 2003 alone, the amount tripled. The NIH budget grew from $3.4 million in 1946 to $1.8 billion in 1974, the year of the National Research Act, to $30 billion in 2009. Since the law that prompted the creation of IRBs was written, the amount of NIH research has increased about 15-fold. Researchers seek to explore the effects of increasing numbers of genetic and other biological and psychological factors on disease and human behavior, and therefore need to include ever larger numbers of patients and consequently institutions. Studies of new treatments now often require thousands of subjects, and therefore conducted at dozens of institutions simultaneously. IRBs at 40 institutions may thus need to approve a single study and vary in their deliberations, decisions, and applications of standards. Among placebo-controlled trials, the number of sites per study has increased 20-fold, from 2 in the 1990s to 40 in the 2000s. One committee might approve a project quickly, while another IRB might send the researcher pages of questions and require multiple changes. Such requests for modifications can not only delay the study, but also alter its design in ways that make the comparison of data between sites difficult. Studies have shown that IRBs vary in their policies and can range dramatically in how long they take to approve the same study, from a few days to over a year. Of 21 hospitals participating in one minimal risk study, the amount of time to receive IRB approval ranged from 12 to 960 days, with none of these institutions changing the basic study. In other cases, IRBs at different institutions have altered the same study in different ways that have made comparison of the results between the sites difficult, thus impeding the science. In a study of 37 IRBs reviewing an identical protocol, 16 required no changes, while 21 required alterations, and 4 IRBs' hurdles seemed so insurmountable that the investigators at these institutions decided not to conduct the study at all. IRBs can also require researchers to spend weeks, if not months, filling out extensive forms that divert limited resources from conducting experiments. For one study reviewed by 52 IRBs, each committee made an average of 5 changes, 76% of which involved only differences in institutional language. No committees made substantial changes to the research, but the cost of the 52 separate reviews was over $100,000. I too have felt frustrated. A few years before my father's death, I had wanted to conduct a simple anonymous survey of patients at my hospital and had submitted the necessary forms to the IRB to receive approval to do so. I had a 12-month state-funded fellowship and therefore only had limited time to conduct the study. Yet, after 3 months, the committee had still not gotten back to me. The paperwork had taken over a month to complete. I had phoned the committee 3 times to get an answer. "The reviewer mispaced your paperwork," a secretary finally told me. "You'll have to resubmit everything." I had lost over 4 months and was furious, but received no apology. I resubmitted the paperwork and a month later received a memo asking for clarification of a few points. I responded the next day and then waited 2 more months to receive approval to begin to interview patients. The committee had not asked for any changes in the study, but I had lost almost 8 months of the 12-month fellowship. The committee also provided no evidence that they recognized the cost of their error to me, the research, or my fleeting career. Many researchers and critics argue that IRBs now often go too far, and the pendulum has swung too much, and that IRBs frequently delay, alter, or block studies unnecessarily and have too much power. These observers aver that IRBs have both too much authority and too little expertise to make decisions well. Evidence suggests that many IRBs review too much, too quickly, with too few experts, conduct minimal continuing review of approved research, and provide little training for members and investigators, and that too little attention is paid to evaluating these committees or their effectiveness. Many scholars assert that these committees have become more stringent in ways that do not increase participant protection and, in fact, detract from the scientific and hence social benefits of research, that these boards are now over-regulating science. Designed to fight the power of pharmaceutical companies and greedy scientists, these boards, many observers say, now have too much power themselves. Studies indicate that scientists support the importance of protecting human subjects, but feel that IRBs have increasingly focused on small, bureaucratic details that detract from the practice of science, and thus from the potential social benefits of the research. Many observers contend that these local committees, established to protect patients, are instead now too often concerned about protecting institutions against potential lawsuits from patients. IRBs may engage in tunnel vision, focusing on editing consent forms rather than on larger ethical issues. Though intended to be instruments of good, these committees have now gone too far, critics argue, blocking important studies and scientific progress. In some respects, local IRBs have absolute authority. No external appeals process exists. If a committee refuses to let a researcher conduct a study or a particular aspect of it, he or she can ask the same board to reconsider. If the board remains steadfast, however, the researcher must comply, even if the IRB lacks the sufficient necessary scientific expertise to evaluate the study in question. Critics contend, too, that the current system spends too much time on low-risk studies, and that over the years, physical injury and death have only very rarely occurred in research. Every year, hundreds of thousands of individuals enter clinical trials and do fine and frequently benefit. Each year, in routine clinical care outside of research, medical errors injure and kill hundreds of thousands of patients. Doubtless, far more than do unethical studies. It is also extremely difficult to judge how effective IRBs are. Ezekiel Emanuel, a bioethicist and oncologist, argues that IRB review cannot realistically prevent the kinds of harm that have occurred in the few well-publicized cases of serious injury. Granted, if the informed consent or privacy protections are not wholly sufficient, so-called dignitary harms may occur, even if the participant suffers no adverse consequences. But critics insist that to prevent such possible non-physical harms, IRBs are diverting too many resources from research itself, hampering science. IRBs cost researchers and institutions significant time and researches, and block certain research without sufficient ethical rationale. Moreover, many researchers, in essence, censor their own research by simply deciding not to pursue certain studies if they suspect that their IRBs will disapprove of or significantly alter the project or require lengthy paperwork. Consequently, a few legal scholars have claimed that IRBs are in fact unconstitutional, impeding free intellectual inquiry and speech. Historically, thinkers from Socrates to Galileo to Darwin have encountered staunch social and institutional opposition and attempts at censorship. Critics assert that IRBs are now doing the same. Scientists have argued that IRBs prevent them from investigating the issues that they want. These committees have been chastised, too, for unnecessarily antagonizing researchers who, in response, may then seek to bend the rules. Complaints about IRBs have become ever more widespread. Clearly, some oversight is needed, but many observers see that the status quo is broken. Engage in over-enforcement, and they recommend regulatory de-escalation. If the majority of critics are concerned that current government regulations designed to protect patients are impeding science, a significant minority argues that current regulations are also keeping valuable new drugs from those who desperately need them. Starting with AIDS activists in the late 1980s, patient advocacy groups began to push the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the NIH to eliminate many of the bureaucratic hurdles to testing and releasing new medications. Many patient organizations continue to argue for more research on particularly lethal or debilitating diseases, contending that government regulations are impeding the development, approval, and availability of new therapies that could have saved thousands of lives. But if, as various critics suggest, the current system should be altered and updated to protect subjects more effectively while still advancing science, how exactly should that be done? What changes should be made? IRBs as a subject of study. From the beginning of my medical training, I felt that medical expertise and compassion were essential and complementary aspects of good doctoring, but were not always simultaneously present. As a physician and a son, I had witnessed patients dying of cancer because effective treatments didn't exist. Yes, I had also observed doctors who were eager to put patients into experiments to try new chemicals that did not seem to offer much more than standard medications, but might benefit a drug company. When the results were later analyzed, my initial wariness often proved well founded. I also knew firsthand that both doctors and researchers face stress that can affect the care of patients, and I had witnessed occasional acts of appalling coldness by colleagues and supervisors. On my first day as a medical intern, for instance, my supervising resident gave me a list of the patients I would be treating, and I walked off to begin my rounds. I remember my first patient vividly. The morning sun poured through the windows, illuminating the pink grapefruit she sat eating with a shiny metal spoon, as we discussed her cancer. Several minutes later, the supervisor asked me for an update in the hallway, and I told him about our conversation. "Don't waste your time with the dead," he retorted. "What do you mean?" I asked, perplexed. "She's dead. Don't waste your time with her." He meant that she had cancer spread all over her body and had signed a Do Not Resuscitate DNR order. If her heart or lungs stopped, we would not try to revive her. In his mind, therefore, we could therefore simply ignore her. I felt as if my own heart had stopped. I soon became interested in medical ethics, and over my subsequent years of training began to study how doctors and patients confront complex dilemmas. For decades, though, I wasn't sure how IRBs fit into the picture. I didn't know how to integrate my mixed feelings about them as a researcher, a doctor, and a son. Were they good or bad? Did they do too much or too little? Certainly, I recognized the reasons for their existence. The IRB members and administrators I met over the years all seemed well-intentioned, yet these boards frustrated and angered almost all researchers, including me. How did a process that outsiders hated so much seem to make sense to those inside it? Clearly, a few researchers have behaved unethically, and patients fear research risks and being taken advantage of. But why did many well-respected, seemingly rational scientists so vehemently dislike IRBs? As a psychiatrist, I was trained to examine how people thought about their lives, actions, and decisions, how they sought to act rationally but did not always succeed. I saw how patients, their loved ones, their physicians come to view disease, treatment, and other ethical dilemmas they face and seek to explain and cope with disease. I had also conducted research in medical anthropology and sociology, which made me interested in how organizations operate and can take on lives of their own. As a doctor, family member, social scientist, and ordinary citizen, I have wondered more and more about the ethics of research on people, and hence about our nation's IRBs, who sits on them, and how they see themselves and weigh their own roles and responsibilities against those of researchers and the rights of subjects. How do or can they effectively sort through all these conflicts and make good decisions? I searched the academic literature and was astonished to find that few studies of these committees have been published. Moreover, these articles were almost all based on simple, short questionnaires, examining only small, particular aspects of these boards. No studies had probed how IRBs actually made decisions or viewed or responded to the full range of these problems or researchers' complaints. Conducting science is instaunchably objective, whereas defining, interpreting, and balancing ethical notions involves inherent ambiguities. Despite this obvious fact, how ethical principles get interpreted and applied differently by different people has received little empirical investigation, observing or interviewing people to find out what they actually do. We are also at a critical juncture, not only in the history of science, but also in the evolution of the university. We like to think that science takes place in a pure world, following pure ideals, and to a significant extent it does. But increasingly, scientists also work in a world of financial strains and constraints as universities, academic departments, and professors slash budgets, tenure disappears, the NIH budget flattens, and pharmaceutical companies face falling profits and layoffs. It seemed to be a crucial moment to delve more deeply into the question of how, exactly, America's IRBs work. Hence, I decided to embark on a journey interviewing IRB leaders, members, staff, and researchers about these realms to see whether the current system can be improved, and if so, how. What I learned consistently surprised me. Science versus human guinea pigs. Research on human beings is relatively new. Some historians credit James Lind with having conducted one of the first formal experiments on live humans when, in 1747, he equipped a group of British seamen with lemons and oranges and then compared them to other seamen. By documenting how many cases of scurvy resulted in each group, he demonstrated both a cause and a cure for the deadly disease. Still, formal human experiments remained relatively rare until the 20th century. The horrors of the Nazi experiments illustrated the tensions between science and human welfare in particularly stark and grotesque terms. Hitler's doctors exposed prisoners to mustard gas, radiation, malaria, and bacteria, and then tried various experimental treatments. These physicians also took advantage of their captive victims to test the limits of physical endurance. For instance, these doctors forced inmates to remain in the snow to see how long it took for them to freeze to death. They also removed limbs to try to reconnect them, but the attempted reattachments all failed. After the war, in response to these horrors, the Nuremberg Tribunal established principles of research mandating that all study participants give informed consent. In the following decade, however, even the U.S. government failed to follow these guidelines, secretly infecting prisoners in Guatemala with syphilis to study the natural course of the disease. Throughout the 1950s, the U.S. military also experimented on its own soldiers, exposing them without their knowledge to various biological and chemical warfare agents. In the early 1960s, researchers at New York's Will Burke State School infected intellectually disabled children with hepatitis by feeding the children stool extracts from ill patients. Outside the U.S., the Nazi atrocities led the World Medical Association to develop the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964 to address the ethics of medical research. Revised 9 times since then, most recently in October 2013, this document now consists of a series of 35 paragraphs articulating broad principles. It is not, however, legally binding, and translating these broad principles into specific regulations has been an ongoing challenge. In 1966, in the New England Journal of Medicine, Henry Breacher, a Harvard anesthesiologist, enumerated 22 cases of egregious ethical violations in research studies that had been published in leading medical journals. Experiments conducted without informal consent that potentially harmed subjects without offering them any benefit. The level of public outrage ignited by this article spurred the U.S. Public Health Service, PHS, to require that institutions receiving federal research funds set up research review committees. These committees, early protoforms of IRBs, reviewed all research funded by this agency to assure, quote, an independent determination of the rights and welfare, unquote, of subjects, and to assess, quote, the risks and potential medical benefits of the study, unquote. But these guidelines remained vague and ill-defined, and did not mention any other aspects of research studies, such as which subjects should be included. Problems also arose regarding experiments that were not funded by this agency and or that researchers assumed were minimal risk. In 1963, for instance, Stanley Milgram, a Yale University psychology professor, asked participants to turn knobs in a shock generator to deliver electrical charges to a person hidden from view who was, Milgram explained, engaging in a memory test. Each time the examinee gave a wrong answer, Milgram asked the participants to administer a stronger shock. Even after the knob position had reached XXX, extremely dangerous, and the examinee had screamed out in agony, Milgram told the subjects that the experiment required that they continue to deliver the shocks. 2/3 of them did so, even after the examinee suddenly fell silent. No shocks were, in fact, delivered. Milgram was using a descent to discover how long his real subjects would follow orders. Yet, many of them were left traumatized by how far they'd been willing to go rather than question authority. Similarly, in 1971, Stanford University professor Philip Zimbardo randomly asked about 24 college men to act as guards and others to act as prisoners in a mock prison. The psychology department in the University Committee of Human Ethics approved the Zimbardo Stanford prison experiment study, and the university's legal counsel wrote the informed consent, which stated that there would be an invasion of privacy, loss of some civil liberties, and harassment. But the guards soon began to abuse the prisoners, verbally and physically. Nevertheless, Zimbardo and 50 other observers let the experiment continue. Only after 6 days, when one observer, a graduate student whom Zimbardo was dating, complained about the severe abuse, did he end the experiment. In both cases, Milgram and Zimbardo had judged their experiments to be of minimal risk, since they did not expect the studies to cause any physical harm. Yet, considerable psychological distress ensued. Then, in 1974, a journalist expose revealed the now notorious Tuskegee syphilis study. Through the early 1970s, the U.S. government had continued to fund this investigation of infected poor African American men in rural Alabama without offering penicillin when it became available as an effective treatment. This scandal prompted Congress to pass the National Research Act in 1974, establishing IRBs as they exist today. Specifically, the Act first established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research in order to determine, quote, the boundaries between biomedical and behavioral research and the accepted routine practice of medicine, unquote. The commission was to develop guidelines to address what the appropriate balance was between risk and benefit and how that balance would be assessed, who could be selected for a particular experiment, and how the investigators should ensure that the subjects gave their informed consent to be a part of it. Eventually, in 1978, the commission provided the Belmont Report, which articulated 3 core principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. The act also led to more precise federal regulations, creating local IRBs to review all federally funded research on humans. These regulations, the Code of Regulations 45 CFR 46, were approved by 17 separate federal judges that conduct research, from the NIH to the Department of Justice, Education, and Defense, and hence are known as the Common Rule. IRBs are mandated to ensure that risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits, if any, to the subjects, and the importance of the knowledge that may reasonably be expected to result. Many other countries have developed their own laws concerning IRBs as well. IRBs today. The U.S. now has over 4,000 IRBs, and hundreds more have been established in 113 other countries. Every institution that conducts research, universities, medical schools, hospitals, clinics, and freestanding institutions, has at least one IRB or arranges to use one at another institution. Every year, these committees examine tens of billions of dollars worth of research, all studies of people involving cancer, heart attacks, strokes, AIDS, diabetes, Alzheimer's, autism, depression, and obesity. They assess, too, all research on humans investigating the mind, brain, and behavior, how we think, learn, remember, forget, eat, sleep, dream, speak, lie, get sick, have sex, grieve, pray, and die. In this country, the common rule dictates that IRBs must have at least 5 members, including at least one scientific member, one non-scientific, so-called lay member, and one member who is not affiliated with the IRB's institution. On average, these boards include about 14 members, but they can have as many as 40. IRBs usually have a chair who oversees the process and is compensated about 20% of his or her salary for IRB work. These committees also have administrators, typically the only ones paid full-time for their work with these committees. Boards customarily meet once a month to decide whether research studies submitted for review, protocols, by researchers or principal investigators, PIs, are ethical enough to proceed or need alterations. Most boards review hundreds of studies a year, and many large medical centers have 5 or 6 of these committees. To ease burdens on both committees and researchers, administrators, or chairs can expedite studies that are minimal risk, or only a minor increase over minimal risk. In an expedited review, only a chair or administrator on his or her behalf reviews the protocol. Ideally, whereas a full committee review often takes months, an expedited review can take far less time. The regulations define minimal risk as not involving more than, quote, ordinarily encouraged in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests, unquote. For riskier studies, 1 or 2 primary reviewers generally read the protocol in depth and present it to the committee as a whole, which then discusses it. Other studies are also exempt from IRB review if they meet certain criteria, such as not involving human subjects. The U.S. regulations stipulate that human subjects are involved if researchers either directly interact with them or collect identifying information about them. Thus, giving a drug or questionnaire to a person is considered research, whereas reviewing the medical records of deceased patients in order to collect their diagnosis and lists of the drugs they took, if those data included no identifying information, would be exempt. The regulations also declare exempt certain kinds of research that involved normal educational tests, in particular settings such as schools. Still, committees generally want to make these determinations themselves, not rely on the researchers to do so. Even for exempt studies, boards generally require that the scientists submit the protocol or a description of it for the chair or administrator to assess. IRBs must approve each study initially, and then review and reapprove it yearly. If a subject unexpectedly dies or gets very sick because of the study itself, an adverse outcome, the researcher must report the event to the IRB, which then has to decide whether to stop the research and/or inform federal agencies and past or future participants what has happened. Although originally mandated to review only federally funded research, most of these committees now review all research on humans conducted at an institution. External grant agencies such as the NIH and private pharmaceutical and medical device companies assess protocols to decide which to fund, but the burden of examining and vetting the ethical issues involved ultimately falls on the IRB. The vast majority of IRBs are at institutions that conduct research, especially universities and hospitals. Recently, however, private for-profit IRBs have also sprung up, which review studies for pharmaceutical companies or others for a fee. Ideally, appropriate IRB review can safeguard subjects, assuring they are adequately protected, uncoerced, and protected from unnecessary harms, all of which is essential for futuring science. As pharmaceutical companies fund larger proportions of research, IRBs can also help serve as bulwarks against any potential industry abuse. IRB failures to protect subjects. Most research proceeds without major problems, but despite IRBs, ethical violations have continued. Starting in the late 1990s, due to egregious practices, the U.S. Office for Protection from Research Risks, OPRR, shut down all research at several institutions, such as the West Los Angeles, LA Veterans Administration, VA Hospital, the country's largest VA healthcare facility, in March 1999, Duke University in May 1999, and Virginia Commonwealth University in 2000. For instance, at the LA VA, a patient refused twice to participate in a study that would prolong his surgery. The researcher decided to proceed anyway and continued the patient's 105-minute surgery an extra 45 minutes, using an electrical probe in the patient's heart to collect data. Another researcher at the institution enrolled a patient with severe delusions who hid bullets in his hospital room. The researcher gave this man a drug to make his heart race and kept him in the operating room longer with an electrical probe in his heart as well. The doctor claims that the patient gave his verbal consent, but no written consent was documented, as is required. These shutdowns sent shockwaves through the country, and many IRBs became stricter. In response, many researchers then began chastising IRBs for being too strict and blocking important studies. Problems have nevertheless persisted, and several cities now lambast these committees for being too lax, not reviewing studies as closely and, well, as they should. Scandals have occurred in which committees have approved certain studies that later proved problematic. In 1999, even after the LA VA and Duke scandals, Jesse Gelsinger, an 18-year-old healthy volunteer, died in a University of Pennsylvania IRB-approved study designed to see if a new gene therapy contained in a virus was safe. The researcher, who was a leading figure in the new, much-hyped field, had suspected problems with the laboratory-altered virus, but continued to inject it into the subjects anyway, including Jesse. The scientist turned out to own part of the company making the therapy and stood to gain millions if it worked. Other IRB-approved studies later triggered lawsuits and harsh condemnations from outsiders, including journalists and judges who argued that IRBs were too beholden to their colleagues conducting research in their institutions. In 1993, researchers at Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is affiliated with Johns Hopkins, undertook a study of the possible toxic effects on children of different levels of removal of lead paint in homes. Exposure to dust from lead paint, which was widely used in homes before 1977, causes severe neurological and developmental problems in children. In the U.S. in the mid-1980s, approximately 675,000 children less than 5 years old suffered from high concentrations of lead in their blood that could cause such problems. Yet, eliminating lead paint from old homes was expensive, between $3,000 and $10,000 per home in the late 80s and early 90s. In poor inner-city cities, landlords balked. Here, the researchers investigated whether less expensive partial removal, rather than total removal, would also be effective. Investigators moved families with young children into one of 5 sets of apartments. Those with full lead removal, those newly built without any lead paint, and those with one of 3 levels of only partial lead removal. The experiment found that partial removal worked, but blood lead levels rose in 2 children. One child was in a partially abated apartment. According to the researchers, the other child's apartment was fully abated. These families sued on the grounds that they were not sufficiently informed of the risks. The Circuit Court of Baltimore dismissed the case, but the plaintiffs appealed to the Maryland Court of Appeals, which ruled in their favor and compared the study to the research conducted at Nazi concentration camps and Tuskegee. The court's majority opinion stated that this study, quote, presents similar problems as those in the Tuskegee syphilis study, in research subjects being intentionally exposed to infectious or poisonous substances in the name of scientific research, end quote. Moreover, the subjects were vulnerable, relatively poor African American children. Other observers, however, included one of the judges who wrote a minority opinion for the court, felt that these comparisons were too extreme. The case was remanded to the Circuit Court for the City of Baltimore and ultimately dismissed. Nevertheless, debates still rage as to whether the researchers should have placed families only in houses with no lead rather than those in which the metal had been partially but not fully removed. The researchers argued that for inner-city landlords, full lead removal was not a realistic goal. Opponents contended that the researchers were thereby endangering these children's lives. The investigators responded that the youngsters in partially abated homes were less exposed than if they had remained in their former, fully leaded apartments. The researchers had hoped that partial lead removal would eliminate health risks. Critics have argued that these investigators should have guessed that even small levels of the metal could nonetheless be dangerous. But other commentators have pointed out that the 2 plaintiffs with elevated lead levels may not have been exposed at their own homes but elsewhere, e.g., at the other homes of friends and relatives or at daycare. The study raises profound questions of exactly how much responsibility researchers and IRBs have for promoting health equity as much as possible when it does not otherwise exist, whether researchers should be permitted to compare current suboptimal practices, patients living in apartments with only partial lead removal, with more robust interventions, i.e., eliminating all lead, and whether scientists should ever be allowed to endanger healthy children without disease. How much evidence is needed to determine that an intervention is safe enough? Given these and other ongoing controversies, many IRBs have become even more stringent, but violations have nonetheless persisted, in which investigators appear to have been deficient. In 2010, Arizona State University settled a lawsuit with the Native American Havasupai tribe of Arizona. The university's researchers had wanted to investigate the tribe's rates of schizophrenia, which were higher than those in the general population, and diabetes, about which Havasupai were concerned. But these scientists feared that the tribe would object to the study of schizophrenia. Hence, the scientists told the tribe that the study was only about diabetes. The university's IRB knew the researchers' plan to study rates of schizophrenia, but approved the plan, including the consent form, which did not mention any psychiatric diagnosis. In 1990, 200 members of the group gave blood samples, but in 2004, they learned that the researchers had published papers about the tribe's high levels of schizophrenia and alcoholism, as well as genetic evidence that the group had come from Asia, whereas the Havasupai believed that they originated in the Grand Canyon, where they now lived, and which they hence claimed to their own. The legal settlement required that the university return the blood samples to the tribe, which then destroyed them. Had the researchers instead interacted with the tribe with more respect, they could perhaps have advanced science in many ways, and even gained rather than impaired the tribe's trust, facilitating an ongoing relationship to improve the group's health. Ongoing pharmaceutical company scandals involving drugs such as Avendia and Neurontin raise added concerns about the roles of industry and academic and other research. Corporations marketing Vioxx, OxyContin, and cigarettes have hidden scientific findings that threaten to undermine sales. In the recent era of multinational pharmaceutical companies, cutbacks in government funding for research, and rising academic pressures to publish or perish, the goals of advancing science and protecting people are increasingly at odds. Scientists seek truth, corporations profit. But pharmaceutical, biotech, and healthcare companies comprise over 1/5 of the U.S. economy, fueling conflicts of interests, COIs, for researchers torn between their need to make money for themselves, their institutions, and their funders, and their desire to uphold the ideals of scientific purity. As the pharmaceutical and biotech industries grow, tensions have heightened. Ever since the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, allowing universities to patent discoveries made using federal grants, major academic institutions aggressively seek patents, earning hundreds of millions of dollars, but heightening ethical strains. As the pipeline of new drugs is drying up, some analysts predict that pharmaceutical companies may search even more desperately, incentivizing scientists to study so-called Me Too drugs, and paying physicians to push patients unnecessarily into using experimental products. Increasingly, U.S.-funded researchers are also conducting studies in the developing world, either because of particular epidemics they are worthy of study, e.g. malaria and HIV, or due to the less stringent regulations and costs of the research. However, private industry, not government, now funds most clinical trials and conducts most of this research in the developing world, heightening the odds of abuse. Government responses. In 1998, in acknowledgement of these varied problems, the Office of the Inspector General, OIG, recommended recasting IRB requirements, granting these committees greater flexibility, holding them more accountable for results, and ensuring that investigators and board members are adequately trained and insulated from conflicts. Yet, few structural changes have occurred since the report, and numerous problems persist. In 2002, the Institute of Medicine, IOM, called for increased assessments of research protections and oversight, and recommended several approaches, including identifying and dismissing best practices, enhancing quality assurance, quality improvement, examining the type and number of FDA and OHRP audits of IRBs, and enhancing accountability and transparency. The report also suggested differentiating IRBs from other institutional compliance, risk management, and COI offices, and having institutions provide adequate resources for these activities. Yet, the authors of this report felt, quote, repeatedly confounded by the lack of data regarding the scope and scale of current protection, unquote, underscoring the need for more research on IRBs, and the impact of this report has been limited. Increasingly, some observers have thus called for essentially revamping the entire system, discarding IRBs, and instead letting research participants sue if they are harmed. Yet this model, used in medical malpractice, may be very insufficient. Others have suggested only slight alterations, or leaving the current regulations unchanged. Standard questions have been proposed to reduce IRB vulnerability, but have not been widely used, although some opponents suggest eliminating or greatly reducing the roles of these boards. What the alternatives might actually look like, or how well they would function, is unknown. Increasingly, these debates have also been rigidly polarized, pro or con, black or white. The system is either crucial or should be scrapped. Researchers and IRBs each argue that the other side needs to change. In July 2011, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, under President Barack Obama, issued an Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, ANPRM, proposing several dramatic shifts in IRB regulations. The Obama administration's proposal focused on only 3 areas: making minimal risk research automatically exempt from IRB review, using central IRBs or CIRBs more in multi-site studies, and questioning how to improve research involving storage and use of biological specimens. The administration also included a list of 74 questions asking how IRBs in fact work and might be changed. The document highlights how vast the areas of the current system remain uncharted and unknown. Yet, this lengthy document, too, has generated debates. For instance, under these proposals, researchers would decide for themselves whether their study is minimal risk, and therefore exempt from IRB review. Investigators would simply then register their study with their IRB, complete a simple, approximately 1-page, form, and immediately begin conducting the research. But under this arrangement, investigators conducting research similar to the Milgram and Zimbardo prison studies could simply claim that their projects were of minimal risk and then proceed to conduct them, with no one reviewing the decisions. If, as also proposed, IRBs become more centralized, local committees may still regularly modify or veto the central IRB's decisions, hereby diminishing key potential benefits of centralization and possibly creating more, not less, paperwork. The document presented more questions than answers regarding storing biological specimens, too. The administration invited public comments to this report through October 2011, yet, as of this writing, the fate of these proposals remains utterly uncertain. This document and the Obama administration's involvement resulted in large part from the fact that Ezekiel Emanuel was involved. At the time, his brother, Rahm Emanuel, currently the mayor of Chicago, was the president's chief of staff. But he has since left the federal government to become vice provost of global innovations and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Whether any of these changes suggested will be instituted, and if so, when, how, and with what results, is unclear. In the end, the administration's efforts may alter the status quo little, if at all. Moreover, other aspects of these committees, on which the administration has not even commented, need attention as well. Strikingly, as the document discussed, relatively little data about IRBs are available, and the underlying causes of their difficulties have received scant attention. Many key questions remain unaddressed. It is still unclear, for instance, why IRBs vary so much and inappropriately block, delay, or approve certain studies, how they themselves view these debates, and how much inconsistency between them, if any, is acceptable. Hence, regardless of the fate of this recent proposal, critical tensions and questions will no doubt persist, given our ongoing advances in science and widely differing views of ethics. We need IRBs, but have they become too stringent or too lax? As a society, we face fundamental dilemmas as to how to proceed, how to balance the social benefits of research against the potential risks to subjects, how much to trust versus monitor researchers, and how to avoid either over or under regulating science. Debates mount, and yet, astonishingly, these controversies range in a relative abundance of data. Similar debates boil in other countries as well, though many other nations in Western Europe and elsewhere rely much on national committees, which thus have much more influence. In addition, the US faces these issues more accurately since it conducts far more research than does any other country. I therefore decided that to understand these vital issues, I first need to examine these committees themselves, to explore how they view and confront these complex problems, how they make the crucial decisions that shape science, medicine, and biology, and hence all of our lives, and whether the various problems mentioned above can be ameliorated, and, if so, how. Past studies of IRBs. It is striking that only a few past studies of how IRBs make decisions have been conducted. In 1969-70, before IRBs as they exist today were created, Bradford Gray, a Yale sociologist, investigated one of the clinical research committees that existed. He examined 54 projects submitted to the committee, read the records, and interviewed 15 of the researchers and subjects in 5 of these projects. He found that the committee may be biased in favor of research and that the informed consent forms sometimes contained vagaries, that subjects may feel that they understand studies when they in fact do not. It is remarkable that the question of how IRBs themselves actually work, make decisions, and view and understand these quandaries has received relatively little attention. Only a few studies of IRBs have been published, and these have focused on procedural and logistical issues. In addition, almost all of this published research has been quantitative, based on very short surveys using multiple choice methods to explore the language and concepts the committees themselves use to understand and describe these areas. Moreover, the past studies have usually each looked at only one or another of these multifaceted issues, ignoring the whole. Nonetheless, even these few published studies focusing on logistics of IRBs, quantitative assessments of size, types of members, workload, gender, ethnicity, and aspects of training, have highlighted several problems. IRBs vary in size and the number of studies they review every year. Overall, they confront heavy workloads, competing priorities, and difficulties in criticizing colleagues' studies and understanding complex science. Eager to review subjects, researchers can sometimes overlook deficiencies in the informed consent. Many institutions and IRB members also have financial ties to a study. In one survey, 36% of IRB members had one or more such industry connections, though this study didn't address how these individuals understood and justified this. These studies have also suggested limitations in the training of IRBs. In another survey of IRB administrators, 75% felt that 80% of the committee members did not have ethical expertise. IRB members use criteria such as scientific merit in their evaluations, but how they judge these criteria or what they consider acceptable or not is unknown. These limited findings are provocative and suggest areas where further study is needed. Nonetheless, the quantitative studies have not examined the contents of committee decisions or disagreements. The reasons variations occur, committees' responses to researchers' complaints, or a host of other crucial issues. 45 years have passed since Bradford Gray's qualitative research exploring the inner workings of committees, and he examined only one board. Many questions arise as to how these issues have evolved and how they differ across institutions. Recently, 2 qualitative studies of IRB members have been published. One sociologist, Chuck Lids, and his colleagues approached several IRBs and managed to observe a few committees. Many said no. These researchers found that community members on these committees spoke less than the other members and were more likely to discuss confidentiality issues. 1 or 2 members usually serve as primary reviewers for any protocol. Among other members at meetings, community members, when they did speak, discussed consent forms more than did other members. In 2012, Laura Stark, an anthropologist now at Vanderbilt University, observed 3 IRBs for her doctoral dissertation. In her subsequent book, she noted several vulnerable points: that members drew on personal as well as professional experience and on local precedents, and that IRBs used the fact that they would need to write a concrete memo to investigators as a way to focus committee discussions, motivate the group to reach a decision, and hide the identities of individual reviewers. Still, a great many essential questions remain concerning how IRBs in fact operate, make decisions about specific protocols, and view and fill their roles. Manuals on how to run an IRB have been published, but no study has systematically examined how these boards themselves grapple with the content of dilemmas they confront, and the full range of uncertainties, pressures, conflicts involved, e.g., how attitudes and contexts shape their decisions. The perspectives of IRBs themselves are essential to grasp what problems these committees face from their own points of view and how they perceive possible solutions. Whatever criticisms IRBs provoke, reforms cannot be designated or implemented effectively without fuller comprehension of the perspectives of the individuals serving on these boards. Although many critiques deride IRBs as powerful, unresponsive bureaucrats, the degree to which IRB members are even aware of and try to address these problems has not, for instance, been explored. Given this lack of knowledge, the sociologist Raymond DeVries recently concluded, quote, "The next step in IRB research must include ethnographic studies that document how members of IRBs interact and make decisions," end quote. Methods. One of my professors, the late anthropologist Clifford Geertz, argued that to comprehend any social situation, we should try to obtain a thick description of the lives and decisions of the individuals being studied, not by imposing external preconceptions or theoretical studies on them, but by trying to grasp their own views in their own words. This approach ideally illuminates not only what these individuals are doing, but also what they think they are doing, and how they understand their activities and challenges they face. For over 30 years, I have interacted with IRBs, submitting protocols, communicating with staff, and speaking at and observing various IRB meetings. To comprehend the inner workings of IRBs as best as possible, I decided to interview individual IRB leaders in depth about their experiences to explore these issues. Unfortunately, many IRBs have refused to allow researchers to observe and study them, requiring these scientists to obtain consent not only from all IRB members and staff, but also from investigators of the protocols being discussed and the funders of these protocols, an essentially impossible task. To understand these committees more fully, I first held focus groups with IRB members and researchers, and subsequently conducted in-depth interviews with 46 chairs, IRB members, and staff from a total of 34 IRBs. I have described the methods far more fully in Appendix A. As shown in Table 1.1, these 46 interviewees included 26 chairs, co-chairs, 10 administrators, including 2 directors of compliance officers, 1 IRB director, and 7 members. Some have occupied more than one of these roles, changing over time. In all, 58.7% were male and 93.5% were Caucasian, reflecting the larger imbalances in these committees more broadly. I also surveyed 76 chairs and administrators of IRBs in the U.S. and 37 from South African SA Research Ethics Committees, or RECs, as they are called in many other countries. I focused on their attitudes concerning reviews of HIV vaccine trials. I found that in both countries, these individuals were split on key ethical issues and agreed that they needed more training. Yet, REC members in South Africa were much more likely to call for major changes in studies and to think that study participants in the developing world did not understand risks and benefits. I also interviewed 17 REC chairs, members, and administrators from 7 RECs in South Africa, and nearly 12 REC members from other developing countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and found that these individuals turn out to confront many similar challenges to their counterparts on U.S. IRBs. These interviews have informed my thinking here as well. The questions, as seen in Appendix B, explored these individuals' experiences and views of research ethics and integrity and related areas. Specifically, what challenges IRBs faced concerning the ethics of research and related areas, how they addressed these challenges, and why. I used follow-up questions to grasp these issues as fully as possible. In the course of our conversations, these men and women reflected on a wide range of issues concerning their roles and work. I am deeply grateful and indebted to these interviewees for their willingness to share their views and experiences, for their openness and candor. They discussed how they think, feel, and make and view decisions that affect us all. Their opinions may not always be wholly objective or include the full reality. In a few instances, it also became clear that some interviewees even misunderstood the regulations. Still, their errors are revealing, indicating areas where larger confusions persist. To protect confidentiality, I refer to associate, vice, co, and former chairs simply as chairs. For the same reason, I do not provide identifying characteristics about these interviewees. Yet, I do not want them to be utterly faceless or have them all blur together. I have, therefore, tried to provide some sense of them as people by giving each a pseudonym and identifying their position, as seen on Table 1.2, and then later by mentioning a few general, non-identifying characteristics about them. Table 1.1 is named Characteristics of the Sample and includes information on the types of people sampled out of the IRBs. Table 1.2 is titled Interviewees and contains a list of pseudonym, first names, and position titles of people interviewed. If I could have included more details, such as the names and features of these interviewees' universities and the specific type of research some of them do, readers would gain a more comprehensive sense of each person. Unfortunately, that might also make these individuals identifiable. At the same time, I would like to stress that their views are not always predictable based merely on particulars of their training, gender, or background. Interviewees from large universities or private institutions did not all look at these issues in the same way. Rather, their attitudes and perspectives appear to transcend these particular external categories. Although this de-identification may make it harder for readers to get to know these subjects, I think that, by the end, a sense of the whole of this world emerges. At once a group portrait and a landscape full of color, shading, and drama. I have published several smaller selections of these interviews in academic journals, but this book provides a far richer, more integrated, detailed, and expansive exploration of these realms. Many key selections of this book have not appeared before. More important, in these individual journal articles, these interviewees do not appear as whole people. This book gives a more complete list of each interviewee and his or her thoughts. The index lists the pages on which each speaker appears, allowing researchers to trace how each person perceived not only one topic, but many. To understand how the system can be improved, a fuller and more nuanced understanding of the world of research ethics is essential. How these committees view and try to fulfill their mandate, how they make decisions, and why. This book reveals what I learned, probing its relatively little-known world. These men and women profoundly alter my views. Much of what I found has not been described before. Much of the literature and most of the debates about IRBs center on whether these committees are good or bad, and whether they should be kept, eliminated, or changed. Many IRB critics argue, for example, that all social science and minimal risk studies should simply be exempt from review. This book provides new data, examines issues that have not been probed, and offers new suggestions and perceptions. I came to appreciate far more the struggles and obstacles these men and women face, and why the current system is frustrated with other researchers and me. I saw how the crucial questions are not whether IRBs are good or bad, but what their roles should be, how and why these committees differ, who should be a member, whether these boards should be altered, and if so, how. I set out on this journey to enhance and/or reform the status quo, but soon confronted underlying issues about IRBs themselves. How they operate, both at the macro and micro level, who their members are, and how they make decisions, interact with, and are affected by larger social forces, including federal agencies, industry, institutions, and researchers. We first need to understand and diagnose these committees before we can fix them. In brief, as shown in Figure 1.1 and elaborated through the chapters that follow, these individuals shed unique light on how the current system functions and can possibly be improved, providing rare glimpses into the conflicts they face. Within intricate social, political, historical, and scientific worlds, they wrestle with a series of dilemmas. They face complexities, define science, assessing and weighing possible future risks, and benefits of studies, deciding what exactly subjects should be told, how much to trust versus monitor scientists, and how to balance advancing science against allowing institutions, researchers, and others to make money and foster reputations and careers. In an age in which, on any given day, many of us online simply scroll down and click I accept, scrolling but not reading or understanding, these committees wrestle with quandaries of not only how much scientists should tell subjects while avoiding information overload, but also how to protect the privacy of individuals who give sensitive personal information, whether to a researcher, a doctor, or a website. Figure 1.1 is called Overview of Issues Concerning IRBs. It consists of a flowchart. Perhaps most of all, these interviews taught me about how we view and interpret ethics in our lives at this particular cultural moment, how we view moral principles in everyday life, and how complex social systems can affect us and our definitions with applications of these precepts. Ever more frequently, our increasingly globalized world witnesses varying moral beliefs. While some critics decry a widespread decay of morals in the U.S., others fear that moral discourse exercises too much of a role in public and political life. In working on this book, I came to understand how far ethical perceptions can conflict and how we can potentially bridge these tensions. Some philosophers believe that in any debate, a single, best-reasoned ethical argument always exists. But I saw how people at times interpret and apply ethical terms in equally reasonable, though different, ways. I often saw how ethical principles did not collide as much as differing interpretations of these principles did. This distinction can potentially help clarify many misunderstandings and debates. I came to see, too, that the work of IRBs is in fact closer to the humanities and social issues than to the hard sciences, filled with complex questions of meaning and interpretation, shadowed by uncertainties, and confronted with in particular social contexts. A few years ago in Greece, I visited the largest intact ancient theater in the world, in Epidaurus, once the center of the cult of Asclepius, the demigod of healing and medicine. This famed theater was, in fact, part of a compound that included a temple and a hospital. From the ancient Greece of Hippocrates through the late 19th century, medicine combined science with humanistic concerns about the patient. Yet ever since the late 19th century, academic medical centers have sought to follow a far stricter scientific model and cultivated a positivist sense that an absolute answer exists for any problem. This notion extends, I would argue, to attributes about IRBs as well. Of course, scientists themselves are not always objective either, and may be affected by various preconceived notions, but arguably they see themselves acting objectively nonetheless. These interviewers, however, showed me how much we need a different model, a more humanistic approach that recognizes and incorporates far more the complex psychological, social, and cultural dimensions of these decisions. Power corrupts, Lord Acton famously quipped. But does it do so here? And if so, how and why? For centuries, power has intrigued thinkers from Aristotle to Machiavelli to George Orwell, Franz Kafka, and Michael Foucault. Orwell, for instance, explored the rhetoric of power, how authority may downplay or deny its power, recasting its might in language of seeming beneficence. Kafka, too, described the disturbing tendency of institutions of authority to be anonymous and unresponsive. Echoes of these tendencies at times surface here, albeit in muted ways. Psychology, decisions about risks and benefits have increasingly been demonstrated to be subjective. Daniel Kahneman received the 2002 Nobel Prize for showing how individuals perceive risks and benefits not objectively, but by using unbiased and heuristics, and overvaluating possible risks more than benefits. I soon found that such phenomenon operate on IRBs as well. We try not to be the ethics police, one of my first interviewees told me. Researchers commonly use this nickname in referring to these boards. The title of this book includes this phrase, not as a label, but instead as a question that I seek to explore and answer. While investigators frequently see IRBs as posing great power, these committees themselves tend to disagree. Why do these two views conflict so radically? What do these contrasts tell us? Do these committees or researchers at times fall short? And if so, how and what should be done? Within the relatively small world of IRBs and trained social scientists, a few individuals may feel that these interviewees' comments are not totally surprising, that IRB variation is not very startlingly. Yet, the extent, scope, reasons, and many of the implications have been very little explored or documented at best. More important, IRBs themselves generally defend these variations, failing to see these differences as a problem. They tend to ignore or dismiss the frequency, breadth, nature, and extent of these differences, and often do not recognize or appreciate either the causes or the consequences. These deficiencies are significant because such discrepancies and the lack of publicly documented decisions and precedents by IRBs trigger many battles, frustrations, and costs for researchers. Lack of consistency undermines the authority and legitimacy of local reviews. Hence, understanding these phenomena is vital. In addition, this book is intended not just, or even primarily, for IRB members and scientists, but much more widely for doctors and other healthcare professionals, policymakers, patients, and their family members and friends, in short, for all of us, as this little-known world directly or indirectly affects us all. In recounting the battles between IRBs and researchers, it would be simpler if each group consisted entirely of either good guys or bad guys, a perspective taken by much prior scholarship. Some IRB members may feel that certain suggestions in this book's conclusion are too radical, while some researchers may think that this book is far too sympathetic to these committees and does not go far enough. But the realities proved far more nuanced than critics have admitted. The often competing goals of advancing scientific beliefs or reducing risks as much as possible can only be reconciled if we better understand the causes of conflicts that arise. The widespread public sense that these committees are removed from most of our lives is a dangerous illusion. Instead, they serve as crucial prisms through which many of the vital struggles of our time between science and ethics, individual freedom and government control, industry greed and individual patients' rights are refracted. Ultimately, whether at the hospital bedside or the prescription counter, the decisions of these men and women impact us all.